This is didnt, the Atari 8-bit podcast.
My vision was constant in the early 80s that microcomputers were the human interface because you could make the information user-friendly as opposed to a bunch of green lines on a terminal, which is the way that most people saw computers in that era.
This is Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast. I'm Kevin Savitz. Stacy Goff was founder of ACE, the Atari Computer Enthusiasts. The group was based in Eugene, Oregon, but grew to more than 50,000 members in 250 chapters in 15 countries. This interview took place on May 6, 2016. In it, we discuss an Atari videotape about users groups called Keeping in Touch, which is available online. You will find a link in the show notes at ataripodcast.com.
In the late 60s and into the 70s, I was first a programmer, then business analyst, then project manager, then manager. And in the late 70s, being involved with databases and things like that, I saw the emerging microcomputers as being the interface between large computers with their massive databases and real people, because the ability to put things on a counter that people could access that gave them access into government records and things like that had to be part of the future. So I started playing in the late 70s with everything from TRS-80s to Apple IIs to Commodore PETs. So I was already interested in that kind of thing. I had already seen the emergence of the game systems and the impact that that had, but I was more interested in practical application rather than just the games. So when the Atari computer, the 400 and 800, came out, I looked at, okay, is it time to buy something now? And it was essentially very similar to the Apple II with one major difference, and that was the Antic chip that let it do sprites and a bunch of other interesting things. Mm-hmm. And so I bought one. Well, in that same time, I ran into, at the computer store in Eugene, Oregon, a pediatrician and a stockbroker. So the three of us got together and decided that, people are going to buy these things, and then after 6 weeks or so, they're going to put them up on a shelf in their closet and ignore them, because I'd seen that kind of thing all too often. So that's kind of what got me started in all of this, because we saw that there was the need for something that helped people to both socialize with other people about computers and to get practical life use out of these fairly significant investments.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So you literally ran into your co-founders and you met in a computer store, or how did that?
Yep. Yeah, I didn't know them before. Mm-hmm. Interestingly, one of them was just 4 blocks away from me. The other was a mile or so away. But we talked about it a couple times and then decided to start a user group. And we kind of modeled it after the Apple Core. I thought that was a great model to run from. And Mike Dunn, the pediatrician, became the newsletter editor. You've got to have communications. E.J. Knoll, the stockbroker, became the membership director, and I became the president. So that's what got us started. And I wrote a bunch of programs, little simple things that let people do everything from, there's one called File Index that helped people keep track of all the programs that they had on their computer, because there was no way to show a directory of all the programs. This was in like 1980. Mm-hmm. When we started sending out our programs, they were in a newsletter and people had to type them in. And that was kind of a headache, because they could be like a page long of typing, and obviously all the problems that you'd have with that kind of thing. So being a little bit computer savvy, we put together a bulletin board where people could connect with a 300 baud modem. That's pretty slow today. And they could download those programs. That's the first time that, at least in the Atari groups, anything like that had ever happened. So that moved us way ahead because people started sending in more complex programs. At the same time, the big come out for Atari Computer Enthusiasts, that's what we called our organization, was when Compute Magazine publicized, probably in about mid-2000, although I have not been able to see that issue in their archives.
You don't
but
mean
they publicized
2000.
what we were doing. What's that?
You said mid-2000. That's not what you
I'm
meant.
sorry, yep, mid-1980.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so I started getting letters from all over the country. And I started a file of letters. Of course, I'd respond to the letter when it came in and show them how to get access to our bulletin board. But also, each time I found two people from the same city, I'd send them both a letter with an instruction about here's how to start your user group, and a bonus of sending one disk full of programs for every 10 members they brought in. Now, we didn't charge anything at all for this. This was all just for fun and for enlightenment. But that really ramped it up. And so, as you probably saw on the LinkedIn page, at the end of 2.5 years, we had over 50,000 members in 250 chapters in dozens and dozens of nations. So,
wow. So even though your group was based in Eugene, you had anyone could set up a chapter anywhere, it sounds like.
Exactly.
And they were incentivized by getting some free software, and you were...
Yep.
Wow.
Now, that was one thing. Another aspect of it was clear that the gaming industry was booming. And so one of the things that we did was to encourage gaming developers to promote and publicize through us. And at that point, most of them were writing for TRS-80, and then some of them were writing for Apple, and some of them were writing for PET. But one of the first steps towards bringing gaming into the Atari computer instead of just into the Atari 2600 was, coincidentally, Broederbund Software was about 3 blocks away from where I lived.
Mm-hmm.
So the Carlstons were great with TRS-80, and I decided to convince them to bring their software into the Atari computer. Well, coincidentally, one of my specialties at that point was strategic planning, and one day I mentioned, what's your strategic plan? And they admitted that they didn't really have one, but they sure had great growth. So I set up a strategic planning session for them where we looked out 5 and 10 years to see what they really wanted to do with their company. And part of the outcome of that was they decided that rather than them being headquartered in Eugene, Oregon, that they really needed to be where the action was in Silicon Valley. So as part of that, in addition to them joining the Atari computer gaming environment, they moved to Silicon Valley in California. So that was a pretty interesting sidelight. I have to say that one of the things that I wanted to do to check up on is the status of Chris Crawford, because he's one person who did more than any other 10 people on Earth to help Atari move from late 79 into 1983. He was a great help to everybody who wanted to write programs for Atari, and he was absolutely brilliant. So he's one of the heroes of that era, and he does get a little bit of tribute for that, but he needs to get a lot more.
Chris is still out there. He's still programming and thinking about games. I interviewed him a couple of years ago, and yeah, he's still doing it.
Now, another aspect that I thought was interesting, I viewed computers then as a tool for people, not just for businesses. And so when Atari established its marketing team for the computers, not just the game machines, they had a vision that, yes, these would be good for people in their everyday lives. So they went out and hired reps, regional representatives around the U.S. and around the world who had more experience with consumer electronics rather than just gaming. And so in the Northwest, the representative that I worked with was Bridget Swartz, and she had the insight of how to turn this into something that you could buy at your local mall store, and went a long ways towards bringing it into mainstream stores, so like Macy's and Meyer & Frank, and they're in the Northwest and places like that. She was our primary interface between our group and Atari. And so when in mid-'82, I decided that it was time to turn this whole thing over to Atari because we were spending way too much time managing all this stuff around the U.S. and a little bit around the world. And I was on the road most of the time as an international project management consultant by then. So we met, Bridget arranged a meeting in Sunnyvale with Atari, where I said, okay, here's what we've got. We'd like to turn this all over to you. And we didn't get a lot of reaction at first because they were going through some of their own problems. But finally, they accepted all of that. And I suspect that the library of programs and all of the coordination of the entire Atari Computer Enthusiast network got merged into the Atari Program Exchange.
I think it's just super interesting that Atari just adopted this external organization. That's just wild to me.
Well, we gave it to them on a silver platter with so much momentum that in any business would love to have something like that. Now, here's a piece of information that I've never found out the truth about. My understanding is that the original Antic chip, they only produced 50,000 of them, and that was what determined the lifespan of the Atari 400-800. And so they had some sense of urgency to come up with the next line, whether it's the ST or the Amiga. That, of course, you know all the history of that. By then, I was kind of out of it, but I think that there must have been more than that, because if we had 50,000 members around the world, they had to have sold more than that. So I've never found out the details.
I've never heard that. That's interesting.
Yeah, Bridget. That was one of the things I wanted to verify with Bridget, but she didn't know for sure about that.
So if that's true, I mean, then you're saying the entirety of the Atari 400, 800 XL series, maybe the XE series, was limited to 50,000 units, which seems like nothing compared to the more than million units that we know the Commodore 64 sold. That just doesn't seem reasonable, really.
Well, but that's a completely different game, though, because that the chip that they put into the when Commodore won that battle, that chip really broke everything wide open. But yeah, I don't think it's possible that we had all of the people who bought Atari computers.
Right. So after you handed it over to Atari, were you still involved, or did you walk away?
Well, I mostly walked away. Although for the next 10 years, anytime I went on a consulting engagement into a city like Atlanta, I would look up and see if there was an Atari Computer Enthusiast group in that city, and write a letter and say, I'm going to be in your city in such and such a date. If you're having a meeting in that time frame, I could come speak at the meeting and give a little bit of history. And I did that actually 4 or 5 times over the next 10 years, but that's obviously not a major level of involvement. And Atari went through its own crash, and so a lot of the things that were there before '83 just kind of disappeared. People left, and in the Tramiel era, it was a completely different company. So there's not a lot of corporate memory in that period.
Right. Yeah. I noticed you mentioned that Filemaster program, or the filing disk filing program you made, and I happened to notice that Antic published a version of that originally uncredited to you. Someone, I guess, lifted it and changed it a little bit and published it in Antic, and then later there was a kind of a correction saying, we discovered after publication that Filemaster is apparently based closely on a public domain program by Stacy Goff.
Well, yeah, in fact, I remember spotting that at some point, like maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and asked for a credit. Maybe it was longer ago than that, but yeah.
So it seems like a little drama.
That's right.
Yeah.
Now, a little bit more insight. I've never been able to get much information about this, but I pushed Atari hard in 81 to do more individual productivity programs and even move into the corporate software arena. Mm-hmm. And of course, I was anticipating things like the IBM PC, and I think that's one of the things that hurt not only Atari but also Commodore and TRS-80. Apple already had a great foundation in education, and so that's part of why they thrived. But Atari was never really interested in the business side. So that frustrated me, and that's one of the reasons why I just kind of moved my focus elsewhere. In fact, even in like 82, when IBM had announced the PC, I was working in Brazil, and I mentioned in a class that Brazil was blocking import of technology, and they were cloning Apple IIs. And I told my course sponsor that, this is kind of silly. If they really want to make money and make Brazil something other than a backwater, if they're going to clone something, they should clone PCs. And so the next time I was in Brazil, they arranged a meeting with the 3 biggest manufacturers of computers in Brazil, and I explained to them why it was smarter to be cloning PCs rather than Apple IIs. So that still has an impact today in Brazil. So that's not related to Atari, but it's my vision was constant in the early 80s that microcomputers were the human interface because you could make the information user-friendly as opposed to a bunch of green lines on a terminal, which is the way that most people saw computers in that era. One of the things that we tried to do was to bring the Atari computer into education, picking up on Apple's success and working with the Minnesota Educational Computer Consortium. We focused gaming for learning purposes on the Atari computers. And so that was an interesting effort that we began. And Ali, the person I mentioned, who's at 8 minutes 45 seconds into the video that you showed, she was involved with that as well. Another interesting side story about this is about 1981, I think. A PhD ed psych contender at University of Oregon had an Atari computer, and I suggested that she should write her dissertation using an Atari computer. And so she took that to her dean, who said, no, that's impossible. You have to use the typists who are trained in writing the dissertation in the University of Oregon way. Mm-hmm. And so she pushed harder and they pushed back. And so I said, well, give me your draft dissertation. And so she gave it to me on a disc. Those were floppy disks in that era that were the 5.5-inch discs. And I put it into my Atari computer, used a word processing program to format it like the dissertations, printed it on a printer that was indistinguishable from a typewriter, gave that to her, and said, show this to your professors and see if this meets the grade. And they thought it was printed or typed by one of the typists, so they accepted it. And she said, now this is done on a computer. Is that okay? And they hesitated and then said, well, it's indistinguishable. So yes, it's okay. As far as I know, she's the first person in the Northwest to ever have a ed psych doctoral dissertation accepted on a computer. And it was done on an Atari computer.
Nice. So before we started the interview, you told me another interesting story I'd like you to relate again about helping someone an older man with bad vision, read the Wall Street Journal using his Atari. Can you tell that story?
Sure. I was into all kinds of uses of computers for people with everything from developmental disabilities to wanting to get more productive. And so the example I mentioned is the person who invented and then licensed all those concrete barriers that you see between construction lanes or on freeways, those vertical dividers. That person was aging and was having great difficulty reading his Wall Street Journal, so he couldn't keep up with the business news. So I worked with his daughter and with him to develop a program that would allow him to read the Wall Street Journal, downloaded at 300 baud with his computer, and enlarged it to like 10 times the size so he could easily read the Wall Street Journal on his Atari computer. So that was about around about 1981 or early 1982. So that's part of the whole interest in using computers for people's everyday needs rather than something that's mystical that only government agencies or big companies could use.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Can you talk a little more about working with the Minnesota Educational Computing Consortium?
I didn't work directly with them, but the people like Marianne, who did the ed psych degree, and then people like Allie Erickson, who's in your movie, they're the ones who were doing that. And as both of them being ed psych majors, PhDs, they were very interested in using computers in child learning. So among the things that they did was to help influence people who were writing for Apple to also write for Atari, and then in some ways using that information to help broadcast the availability in the local schools. Somewhat related to that, Marianne's major or her dissertation was all about using computers to help in schools, and so one of her studies involved a particular question. And so this shows how even in 81, computers were going a long way to help people in education. Her challenge was that the intelligence tests, the Wechsler, I think it was, are oriented not as much towards measuring intelligence as measuring learning disabilities. And there was already great use of the intelligence tests for that purpose, but to teach a teacher how to properly give an intelligence test, you had to go through about 12 to 16 different students so that the teacher learned the right pacing and the right way to ask the questions, so that the teacher's performance didn't affect the student's performance. So I wrote a program that helped her to simulate a child taking a test that the teacher who was learning how to give the test would use for the first 8 to 12 times to learn most of the pacings, learn most of the sequences and the pauses, so that you only burnt up, so to speak, 3 or 4 children to finalize that teacher's training. So that was part of her whole dissertation, and a simple little program on the Atari that said, I want to choose the child's disability, I want to choose their personality, and then the teacher used the computer to practice giving the test to that child who demonstrated that profile. And again, that was around 1981 or early 1982. So there's a lot that was done with computers even then in addressing my interests, which is people using computers as part of everyday life.
Nice. You mentioned on your LinkedIn profile that Atari's portable ST, they called it the Stacy. You kind of imply that they named it after you, and I'd like some clarification if that was just a happy coincidence, or if you actually think that you were its namesake.
Well, there are people left who know that I was interested in portable computers, and people left who know that I was interested in Atari moving into the business arena. But the reason I left it kind of tongue-in-cheek in the LinkedIn article, I've never gotten any verification that that's why they named it the Stacy. I think Stacy is a pretty weird name to name a computer, but I can't think of any rational reason unless clearly it starts with the ST of the line that followed the Atari 800 and 400, but I've never gotten any verification, so that's why it's kind of a tongue-in-cheek mention.
All right. I'd like to go back a little bit, and if you could briefly tell me about the meetings themselves. I mean, you attended all these meetings in Eugene, and I am now an Oregonian, and I would like to know, paint me a picture of a typical meeting, if you would.
Okay, well, there were two kinds of meetings. Our membership meetings were primarily all about what's new and what's hot, and it was the place where we distributed the newsletters, and especially before people could download them. Sometimes the meetings involved demonstrations of the latest, greatest software that we'd gotten, because even within the first year, it became clear that the way to get on a bestseller list is to get your game, and often it was a game, reviewed by the Atari Computer Enthusiasts newsletter. So it was a combination. There wasn't a lot of business per se. It was, here's what's new, so it's news. It was, here are some of the great new games. To some extent, it was talking about the growth and how do we manage it all. And we were getting people engaged with, if you can imagine mailing out thousands of paper newsletters, that was a big part of it. So those were like monthly, and it was more an opportunity for people to talk about the problems that they're having and ask questions and see the newest stuff. The second dimension was the classes. For example, I mentioned Miles, the child there at 8:45 in the video. At that point, he was proficient in English, French, and BASIC. We had brought together a bunch of talented and gifted kids and had them working on a game, on a computer game. Mm-hmm. And separately, we had a group of learning disabled kids, and we had them working together on a game. And the intent was each person would be working on their part, and we'd bring it all together from both groups. Well, it never really worked out because there were pieces that were missing, but it was one part a way for people to learn how to write basic programming language applications. Another part, a way to socialize around computers, and then finally, a way to do something productive and fun so that you could see your results. So some of the people got to see their pieces actually working in solitude, but we never managed to bring together the whole application. We had too many gaps and holes. So we did a lot of that kind of thing. Classes that were as few as one or two people, or as many as typically no more than 12 or so, because you know today it's still hard to have 12 people working on computers and help them all at the same time.
Absolutely. So in the end, why don't you think Atari won?
Good question. I think that there are a couple things. One, you know that the guy who invented Atari was more into the games than anything else. He was eased out after Warner Communications came in, and So I think that the company didn't really meet Warner Communications' expectations, and so funding became a little bit tight. I think that the whole struggle over the Amiga chip destroyed Atari's next generation computer. When they lost that process, that took them down, because what that brought was sound that matched the graphics that Atari was superior about. I think another part is that IBM PCs kind of took the air out of the room. Yet another part is that the game industry soared so much and took so much energy out of not just Atari, but also the other companies, that when that crashed in about 83, there wasn't a lot of air left in the room for keeping the computer systems going. Apple's saving grace was that they'd started a good lead in the schools. In that period, the TRS-80 kind of died out. Commodore went big with their win with the Amiga chip, because until that point, they had the least effective computer in my analysis. And if you look at management generations, in a founder mentality, there's a vision and zeal that doesn't exist in second generation management. And then when second generation management, they do a good job of doing the MBA stuff, but they don't develop the passion. And so a third generation, which is what Atari was in by the time Jack Tramiel took over, you've either got to reestablish the vision and passion, or you use other methods to make the company work. And Jack didn't have that capacity, I don't think. So I think that's the obituary for Atari.
Yeah.
My opinion.
What haven't I asked you that I should have?
I think you've asked most of the things. I think that the most important question that we should all ask is, what were the main things that bridged from using these chips for games to things like the Macintosh and the IBM PC, the next generation products that helped them to take over to the point that is now what computers are to most people today. There was a huge leap that we made from about 1977 or so to 1984. And this story, Atari's early years, is a part of that. So what are the things that helped us to make that societal leap?
I think I have two more questions.
Okay.
First of all, what do you do today?
Well, I'm semi-retired. I've spent the last 35 years going all over the world and teaching companies how to manage projects and programs more effectively. And for the last 15 years, doing a lot more nonprofit work in the area of project program management, managing societal change. Now I'm spending most of my time catching up on all the projects around the house that have been languishing for 15 years and writing a couple of books.
Nice. What are your books about?
One of them is about small project management. Mm-hmm. And given that my discipline of choice these days is project management, a short story about that. In around 1995, Project Management Institute published research findings that there were 250,000 project managers in the world. I'm quoted as responding that, au contraire, there are 6 billion people in the world, and project management is a core competence for anybody over the age of 5 or 6 when they start working together into teams. And so the true project management audience is in the billions. So Small Project Management is the book for those billions.
Excellent. If you could send a message to the members of the Atari Computers Enthusiasts, some of whom are listening to this podcast now, what would you tell them?
Congratulations for your contributions to the advancement of society using computers to get results for people.
Great. I think I have what I need, Stacy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kevin.
If you enjoyed these interviews and would like to contribute something, I encourage you instead to donate to one of our favorite organizations, the Internet Archive, at archive.org. The Internet Archive is a nonprofit digital library with the stated mission of universal access to all knowledge. They've done incredible things to preserve computer history, including hosting thousands of programs in an in-browser Atari emulator, creating the Wayback Machine, and offering full-page scans of countless Atari computer books and magazines. Make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate.